Well, hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Between Two Sundays. This is Mark Gladman, and this over here with the hat, or if you're on audio, the voice you're about to hear is Mr. Mark Beresford. How are you, my friend?
I'm very well. How are you?
Alive and kicking and
Good.
ready to rip into another episode, which is not a chore, to be honest.
That's good.
At all.
I'm glad to hear that.
At all. So we are into the Lenten season. We are a week out from Ash Wednesday. We are, 5 or 6 weeks out from Easter week. And we are in the midst of this time of reflection and meditation. Yeah. And obviously, as per every episode of Between Two Sundays, we've been living out of these readings from the first Sunday of Lent, which was the Sunday just gone. Yeah. Mark, what have you brought into this week from the Sunday readings that you're messing with? Messing with, that sounds great, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, well, it does sound great, actually. I think I'm quite convinced we're supposed to play with Scripture.
Oh, yeah,
we're supposed to imagine into it and enjoy the process. And, it's not so much about exploring to be right as it is exploring to enjoy the journey. So
absolutely
messing with Scripture, you're talking my language.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. I've really been struck by this gospel reading and the reality that Jesus faced real temptation. I find that such a humble position for God to take. And such a radically human position for God to take. I'm really kind of blown away by this, actually, and just as Hebrews says, just how close this is to God like us. So I feel that to be quite a humbling place for me to consider that God sits. I know James says God can't be tempted, but I wonder how this passage kind of sits with that, unless you take a very, a very harsh or a clear boundary between God and Jesus. We really see Jesus facing something that's very fundamental to our experience as people.
Well, we mustn't forget too that Jesus was fully God yet fully human. So I don't think that we can say that Jesus wasn't tempted, and think one of the beautiful things about the idea, as you say, is that there's an understanding. We have someone in Jesus who understood exactly what it is that the human person goes through and can relate to us in that, which I think is Hebrews. We have a great high priest who can resonate with everything that we experience.
Exactly.
It has to be like that.
Yeah. There's something, I know this sounds obvious, but I think it's constantly worth stating that temptation is not sin. I think we, most of us, I suspect, would kind of affirm that. But it's hard for us to live it. I think there are moments where we struggle to live that way, and give ourselves this level of grace, that just because something draws us that we want to resist on some kind of level, that's not our rebellion against God. That's not our that's kind of what it's like living living the call to love in an unloving world. I think this is kind of one of the natural outcomes of it, and clearly one of the outcomes that Jesus faced as well.
Absolutely. For me, I really spend a lot of time living into this gratitude idea that we have this, this
Yeah.
sense of gratitude and thanksgiving that happens through those 4 readings from Sunday, and I guess it, like other times, it's just made me to be very mindful of that, to be mindful of what I can give thanks for as I go through not just this week, but through this whole Lenten period. Lent can be, as we mentioned last week, some people can treat it like a very sad and sorry and down time, but to be able to approach it with a sense of gratefulness and gratitude, there's a lot, gives me a lot of strength. Not to get through Lent, but man, gratitude just helps you see the world in a completely different way than what we usually see it, doesn't it?
There's a reason that psychologists nowadays seem to go on about gratitude all the time, and it is something deeply fundamental in us that orientates us towards what is good in our lives rather than towards what is negative. And I see this happening in this Deuteronomy passage. This is a reorientating, with all the challenges that have gone on for Israel as they enter the promised land. Here is a practice, if you like, that's asking them that's reminding them to look at the good, to look for the blessings, and not to miss them. And it's very intentional, as we said. There's pilgrimage here, there's the recitation, there's almost a call and response kind of thing that looks like it goes on between the priest and the people as they bring their gifts. There's a deliberate preparing of the basket, which I just think is wonderful. And as we said last week, the choices within that. All of these things give space for gratitude, and they're very deliberate here, I think, in empowering people to intentionally embrace time and practice to see the good.
What's interesting about gratitude, I have found of late, not just this last couple of days, but gratitude slows us down. I don't know if you've noticed that. When you're walking along, but you're intentionally and mindfully seeking out that for which we can be grateful for, it makes you incredibly observant, and it makes you incredibly mindful in the moment, and slows you right down. And not just the process of finding the thing to be grateful for, but then to extend that gratitude in the right mode, the right posture, the right way. Do you need to say something to someone? Do you need to stop and acknowledge something? So it's got this incredibly beautiful way of slowing us down and stilling us a little bit. So
that's really interesting you say that, Mark. Brené Brown talks a lot about whether we have enough. Are we living in a culture that has enough? And if you live with the sense that there's not enough, you end up rushing around seeking more. So our lives become more and more hurried as we think we have less and less. So there's less time, so we need to do more with it. There are less resources, so we need to make sure we get all the resources that we possibly can.
Right.
And you've just kind of pointed to the flip side of that when we think there is enough, we can actually slow down and enjoy and embrace the gift of a moment, or the gift of life, or whatever gift we're actually gracious for, expressing gratitude for. These things slow us down and enable us to live in the moment.
Yeah.
Which is, as we've said so often, is actually all we've got. If we live in the future, well, we're living somewhere else other than where we are. if we live in the past, the same is happening. All we have really is this moment, and we miss living if we spend our time in any other kind of zone.
Yeah.
But gratitude, I think, pulls us into the present.
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I've been finding of late. Yeah, not to mention the last couple of days. So, well, we are into Lent 2 today.
Yes.
This weekend coming. And so our readings are from Genesis 15, verses 1 to 12, and then verses 17 and 18. Psalm 27 is the psalm. Philippians 3, verses 17 through chapter 4, verse 1. And then Luke chapter 13, verses 31 to 35. And of course, all of those scriptures will be in the show notes or just below us down here if you're watching us on YouTube. So again, a very interesting set of readings to reflect on during this season of Lent and for the purposes of what Lent is. Mate, where did you find yourself zeroing in? Where did Spirit draw you this week?
Yeah. So Lent is leading us to see Jesus humbly crucified by the powers that be. And here we have a very short little dialogue here in the gospel reading that starts by referring to Herod as a fox and ends with Jesus describing himself as a chicken. Now,
the Herod as a fox thing I love, but I've never noted the chicken thing before and the connection between those two. That's interesting.
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? This is, I wonder if you could argue that this little dialogue is another prediction of what is to come. I've got less chickens in my backyard than I did when I bought them all. And I suspect a good part of that is the foxes that are around. This is a dialogue that holds sort of classic enemies against one another, and one is very powerful, and one is very vulnerable, and it's in this vulnerability of the chicken next to the fox that Jesus expresses his love and desire to gather and create a community, or to create a family, I think is probably the image used here. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. I think there's something very powerful and very Lenten in this little passage. I think Jesus is describing himself as vulnerable, and in that vulnerability desiring to protect and gather and hold. I actually think it's a beautiful image. And the other thing about this image, Mark, is the chicken who gathers her hens is a female image. This is a female parable, if you like.
This is the feminine, yeah.
It's the feminine coming through. Such a wonderful thought that Jesus, in this very patriarchal society, would adapt such an image to describe himself and describe what he's doing coming into Jerusalem. So I find myself wanting to go back to that image, to play with this idea of, one has all the power here and one is very vulnerable. yet this is God speaking about God's intentions in the world. And once again, they are humble, they are self-sacrificial, they are given for others. This beautiful reflection on what the heart of the God who created everything that is actually looks like. And as we've said so many times, what an extraordinary picture of reality it is for us to hold to the idea that Jesus is like this, and reflecting the very heart of God. So God is like this, the God in whose image we are created.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, the go tell that fox thing. My understanding is that Herod and the Herod family, the family seal was something like a lion.
Right.
And that Herod had already, fashioned himself as a lion, this great figure. And so the go tell that fox thing was actually a backhanded slap that if others were listening, literally would have had them looking at each other going, ooh.
Yeah.
Did he just call Herod a fox?
Yeah,
Are you kidding me? Sly, cunning fox instead of this regal, noble lion. So it's a bit of a backhand. But I love that play with the fox and the chicken for the very reason that, as you mentioned, that the hen image draws on that vulnerability, which before we came on, I said to you, I said, look, man, I'm sitting really well with the first three readings. It's the gospel that I'm trying to see a connection for where I feel I've been taken in the first three, but that exactly nails it.
Oh, really?
The idea that you have this God who is, or this Jesus who is vulnerable and is putting themselves in a vulnerable position in order to create space for people to come and be. So that's perfect.
Tell us what you found.
Here's the link. So if we go into Genesis, all right, so Genesis 15, and this is God and Abraham. This is one of the most, some Jewish people would call this is the hinge verse of the covenant, of the whole of who Israel is, because this is the hinge verse on which that family of Abraham came to be in covenant with God. This is the moment. This is the passage that's all about that time. But what's really interesting is this: you have Abraham basically saying, "Well, how do I know you're going to do it? How do I know? How can I trust you? Whatever." When God's made all these promises, and so what happens is that God says, lay out the animals, cut them in half. So he does half the heifer, half the goat, half the ram, and it just leaves the turtle doves whole, because I guess that'd be a bit messy. And then he lays them, with a gap between the two, with the halves on either side. And then as the sun goes down, verse 12, a deep sleep fell on Abraham, a deep and terrifying darkness descended on him. And when the sun had gone down, it was dark. A smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. Now, what's really interesting about that? You think about the pot and the torch. Well, the smoking pot is literally an oven. It's one of those small portable clay ovens that nomadic people would carry around. They would bury it in the ground and they would cook in it and that sort of thing. The torch obviously brings light. And so when you think about, well, how is this an image of God? The light makes sense, but what's the smoking pot? Well, we'll get to that in just a second. But what's really interesting is that while the pot and the torch represent God, the symbolism of God walking between the pieces, what I discovered through doing some work around this passage is that when they would cut covenant like this, when you would have them separate, it's the less, what's the word that they used? It was the more vulnerable, the less powerful party was the one that would walk between the pieces. So the less powerful is the one that would walk between the pieces, not the most powerful. Abraham does not walk between the pieces.
Yeah.
the smoking pot and the flaming torch do. In other words, God is the more vulnerable. Also interesting about this is Abraham is asleep the whole time. He sees this
Yeah.
whole thing happening in a dream. So he's completely passive in this thing.
Yes.
God is actively making covenant with Abraham and all of Abraham's descendants. What's interesting is that Abraham doesn't even respond. So not only is this a God who is putting themselves in the position of the vulnerable, this is a God who's saying, you know, you may not do anything here, but I'm still going to hold to this. So all of a sudden, now you can see, right, why I'm a bit excited about this vulnerable chicken image. Okay.
Yeah.
So then if you go to the Psalm 27, again, you've got this beautiful psalm that's all about being in this protection and this safety with this God. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And so God in this psalm is literally the safe haven, the hen gathering the chicks, which is that beautiful image. But I love, straight away in verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation. And you can see already the connection with the Genesis passage. You have the light, and then we've got that oven, the smoking oven, salvation. All right, bear with me, because then we get to the Philippians reading. And in the Philippians reading, man, this was so fun. I don't know, to be honest with you, what people sometimes mean, or even if they know what they mean, when they're talking about the cross of Christ. I think some people think about the crucifixion of Christ. Some people think about the death of Christ. Some people think about the death, burial, resurrection of Christ. But what's interesting is about that whole Easter story is that it's often called the Passion. And the reason why it's called the Passion was because this was the desire of Jesus with the, being incarnate of the Spirit, the incarnation of the Word of God, was their whole focus, their passion was to live a life that exemplified what it meant to live in this perfect communion with God, so that others could look at that and go, that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like to live in union with God. That's what it looks like to live in right relationship with others. This is what it looks like to be the realm of God that God had set up from the beginning. This is how we're supposed to live into it. To the point where Jesus was willing to die on a cross rather than fight back a bit against people who were falsely accusing him. I don't think he was a wuss through the process, but I do think he stopped himself short of doing things that would have been less humble or reactionary or whatever. And so as I reflected on this idea of the cross of Christ, and in verse 18 of Philippians 3 there, for many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. I know, back particularly in my very right-wing evangelical days, I would have been thinking about that as these are people who are living as enemies of, Jesus being whatever, in that whole cross of Christ scenario. But the cross was literally Jesus' willingness to walk a path of love in the face of the aggression of the people who were around him. And so the cross really represents the way of Christ. And we often talk about that, walk in the cross of Christ. Paul talked about that all the time, walk in the way of Jesus. And what is the way of Jesus? It's to walk in the resurrection life, or walk, carrying the cross, he would often talk about. And so where it's talking about enemies of the cross of Christ, I really think Paul is talking about enemies of Jesus' way of living in the world, the way that Jesus tried to show us. So what we have is this Jesus who freely lives this way to show us what a less powerful, in worldly terms, form of living looks like, this way of love. While it's less powerful in terms of the world, it overcomes even to resurrection. And so this verse that's just after that, their end is destruction, their God is the belly. Now, a slightly better translation of that was their God is their appetites, the things that they seek after to fill their emptiness, to fill their void. And so this idea of filling yourself with what is good, filling yourself with what is wholesome, filling yourself with what will satisfy. Why? I can't remember where maybe it was in one of the cross references I studied, but why do you seek bread that will not fill and water that won't allow you that won't quench your thirst? Why do you seek after those things? Seek after bread that will fill you and seek after water that will quench your thirst. And so this idea of filling your belly, what do you fill your belly with? You fill your belly with what God will provide, which Jesus called the bread of life. And what do you cook bread in? Smoking fire pots.
Oh, I like it.
That's what you cook bread in. So literally what you have in the Genesis story is this God who's represented both as light, but as the source of the very thing that will fill us and satisfy us, as representing God. In the psalm, you have this psalm of what it looks like when we're truly finding our satisfaction in God, that we are completely content. We've got nothing to fear because God is the stronghold. We need not be afraid. And the whole psalm describes what that looks like, to live in that contentment, knowing that God is your light and that God is the source of the bread for your spirit self, your inner self. The passage from Philippians, fills this on even more, that, we can't be enemies of the way of Christ, but that we, don't go after filling our appetites with things that aren't going to satisfy us, but to fill ourselves with good things. What is that? Our citizenship in the kingdom of God. From there, verse 21, he will transform the body and conform it to his glory. And so there's that transformation that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. And of course, this whole image of this vulnerable God who puts themselves in the most vulnerable position, Jesus speaks of again, but not just one who's more vulnerable to someone who's more powerful and authority, but one who is vulnerable but is going to provide protection. I find that really compelling, that it's not the fox or the lion even that's going to be the all-pervading protector of things. I mean, go tell that fox. Later on, he could have said, "Oh, Jerusalem, I wish I were a leopard or a wolf or something like that. But no, I'm a chicken."
Yeah.
But the chicken, and I mean, I don't know if you've ever had an antsy chicken chase you, man. One that's trying to protect its brood.
Sometimes.
But boy, they're scary. At the end of the day, I think these passages truly exemplify that image that you were talking about before.
And isn't it all so appropriate for Lent? This time that invites us to learn again to take the humble path. And really we have here pointers to the humility and service of God for us. I was just thinking as you were talking, there's something about the context here that makes this gospel reading even more potent, I think, and that is that it's taking place in Jerusalem. So Jesus is, overseeing Jerusalem. He's finally got here. And this is the realm of Herod. So this is, Jesus chooses both these images, as you've said. This is not Herod's image for himself. So here is Jesus entering the realm of Herod and describing Herod as a fox and himself as a chicken. This is the chicken entering the fox den.
Oh,
and entering to protect, the vulnerable, to protect, I guess, what's already in there, and that is these chicks.
that's interesting.
It is, just like so many of the parables, this is not Jesus responding to, an image that someone else chooses. This is Jesus putting both these images on the, into the discussion. They're both chosen by him, and he could have chosen others, but hold them together. Oh my goodness, this is really a very Lenten kind of reading, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's really preparing us to hear the Easter story again, as we said last week.
Which, that last verse, I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, which is, of course, what we start doing on that start of Holy Week on Palm Sunday.
Yeah, it's just about to happen here too. So here is Jesus overlooking Jerusalem, so to speak.
That's right.
He's about to enter it, and they will cry out, blessed be the one who comes in the name of the Lord.
Yeah. Whew.
Yeah.
I do that a lot after we've had a chat. And man, this I don't know, we've said this a number of times too, but I know we've got quite a few bunch of new listeners and followers and watchers or whatever. But there's something about doing this in community with other people. It's all very well and good to sit there and read it and chew on it, but even today, just to share what we had and to see how even those things link together, and there's so much strength in that. So encourage you folks to find someone that you can nut out scripture like this with someone.
Yeah. Real privilege.
And certainly, please, as we keep saying, if you've got thoughts, ideas, your own takes on things, we'd love to hear about them. So drop us a direct message in the Instagram, which is at Between Two Sundays, or head on over to the Barefoot Follower website where the links are in the show notes to both those things, or at least a link tree, which will get you to both those things, and leave comments and let us know what it is you're thinking and how you're chewing on these things, because iron sharpens iron, and we really want to be. I don't know about you, Mark, I'd really want to be sharpened continually.
Absolutely.
So that is Lent 2. Anything else you wanted to add, mate, before we wrap it up for today?
I think we're doing pretty well. I think this is happening. I've got plenty to chew over from these readings. So
yeah,
I think that's probably enough.
Well, there you go. Lent 2. This is Between Two Sundays. That's where we're headed. And of course, next week, we'll let you know how we walked out of Sunday, and we'll be walking into Lent 3. So make sure you join us for that next week on Between Two Sundays. Thank you, Mark.
Good to see you.
Bless you, mate. And bye, everybody. We'll see you next week. Cheers for now.
Yeah. Bye.